Bach wrote more sarabandes than any other dance type. And most of these appear as virtuoso pieces in solo suites, like the cello suites. They're technically demanding, and because they're unaccompanied, we have that wonderful sense of expressive freedom. I think this is why the relationship between music and dance in the sarabande feels a little bit elusive. We also tend to think of the sarabande, positioned in the center of the suite, as slow and majestic and serious. And so it doesn't suggest dance to us in quite the same way as do the minuet, the bourrée, the gavotte, the gigue, and the Italian currentes, which appear in all but the fifth suite. But I think you'll be surprised, perhaps even a little bit shocked, to discover just how much of the French court dance is in Bach's sarabandes for cello, and how this can radically transform our understanding of their expressive details and how we might play them. I would like to share a sarabande experience that I had a number of years ago. I was getting ready to perform the C major suite, and I was warming up, and it just so happens that the wonderful Baroque dancer and choreographer Paige Whitley-Bauguess was also there. She was dancing to another piece on the program. So I'm warming up, and I get to the sarabande, and I play. And when I stopped, I heard this voice from across the room, and it said, "You know, I could never dance to that. It is way too slow." I was rather taken aback. It felt right to me, it felt expressive, it felt idiomatic, and I thought I knew what I was doing. But I was ready to try faster, so I did, but no, still too slow. I added a little more tempo, no, still too slow. And I don't know what tempo we ultimately arrived at as danceable, but I do remember that it felt absolutely ridiculous. I was racing around the instrument, I was rushing to meet the next beat, and I felt as if I was almost mocking this really sublime movement. I had a concert to play, and so I said to myself, well, Bach never intended that these dance movements should actually be danced. But even as I was making this justification to myself, I was also acknowledging that not danced and completely undanceable are two very different things. Just because I couldn't readily make this work didn't mean that I could ignore some really useful information. It's not really surprising that the sarabande has come to be considered the slow movement of the suite and is treated as such. For most sarabandes, no tempo indication is given, and sometimes the term sarabande isn't even present. One has to simply recognize it from the form. But when there are words, they tend to be ones like gravement, in a grave or serious manner, or lenteur or sans lenteur, without slowness, which would seem to only imply that the norm is to play slowly. But these tempos, even slow and very slow, are clearly meant to be danced. They come with choreographies. So what does slow mean for the dancer? There's no single metronome mark that works for all sarabandes. A lot depends on the character of the individual sarabande and of course the individual dancer. In general, the slower the sarabande, the more skilled the dancer needs to be. A stately sarabande, like Tomlinson's, which he labeled very slow, might be danced at around 69 or 72 to the metrical beat. In another more tender sarabande, a deceived lover might seek consolation over her plight at a tempo of around 84. A sarabande set as a Spanish air might be quite lively at around 90 to the metrical beat.
On the other end of the spectrum, we found that the tempo of about a quarter note equals 60 can work for some of Bach's sarabandes in the cello suites. But more importantly than metronome mark is the overall flow of the meter. Simply playing metronomically is not going to inspire anybody to dance. We have to find out what it is about the meter, about its cadence and its rhythm, that makes it danceable and hopefully at the same time playable. The sarabande that Bach knew was essentially a French dance, but its more overtly outrageous and passionate Spanish predecessor was still very much present, underneath the veneer of French niceties that were added in order to make it suitable for the French court. We have a truly remarkable description of a sarabande as danced by a solo male dancer. This is from a French and Latin dictionary published in 1671, of which I'm going to read just a small part. At first he danced with a totally charming grace, with a serious and circumspect air, with an equal and slow cadence, and with such a noble, beautiful, free and easy carriage that he had all the majesty of a king. Sometimes, with the most beautiful timing in the world, he would remain suspended, immobile, and half leaning to the side with one foot in the air, and then, with another more precipitous cadence, he would almost fly, so rapid was his motion. Now and then he would express anger and spite with an impetuous and turbulent cadence, and then, evoking a sweeter passion, he would sigh, swoon, let his eyes wander languidly. Admittedly, the language here is flowery and extravagant, really a product of its time. But what an incredible mental image this description gives us, and also a sense of the expressive variety that is in the sarabande. The musical phrase structure of the sarabande is based on a 12-beat dance rhythm over 4 bars in either 3/4 or in 3/2, as we find in the D major suite, and which is perhaps suggestive of its grand scale and character. A number of sarabande choreographies have been preserved for us in the beautiful Beauchamp-Fouillé notation, and as is typical, many are set to the music of Jean-Baptiste Lully. The melody is provided along with the steps and movements and the extraordinary floor patterns the dancers would create as they move about the room. Rarely do you find anything but 4-bar phrases in sarabandes, and this is true for all of the sarabandes in Bach's cello suites. They're all divisible by 4. It's a beautifully balanced form. 2 4-bar phrases combining to make an 8-bar phrase, and kind of question and answer relationship, or antecedent and consequent. And often, to a greater or lesser extent, there's also an inflection between the 2 2-bar phrases in a 4-bar phrase. I think the answer to finding the tempo and pace of the sarabande is in this larger form. If we think in terms of larger units rather than individual beats and their subdivisions, we can actually play quite quickly and still maintain that overall sense of a slow movement. Larger rhythmic units allow for greater freedom of the smaller values within them, and as the pace flows, we then have more time to breathe between phrases. All of this, I think, helps to create that balance, that suspension and wonderful timing before flowing forward that we read about in the earlier description of the danced sarabande. So it's the regularity and the predictability then that enables all the really special moments to happen. Speaking of special moments, this is the way that I like to think about the second beat of the sarabande, as special. Many of us will have learned in music history classes that the second beat is the important one, the point of emphasis and accent. Very often it's elongated, there's often a dissonance associated with it, and it becomes a real focal point. This is true. But at the same time, there's so many ways that that second beat can be expressive, really an infinite number of ways. So for me, the term special really conjures up all of those possibilities. In addition, I don't want to think about the second beat in a way that undermines the first beat. The first beat is, after all, the metrically important one. It's the one that gives us our sense of 3 that characterizes the sarabande. It enables the second beat to be special. For instance, if the character is regal and serious, both the first and the second beat are going to get a certain amount of accent. Or perhaps it's a tender passage. Sometimes the dissonance on the second beat needs just enough weight to be really poignant. But then
the downbeat becomes a more urgent dissonance with the dominant seventh chord, and the second beat begins the release of tension and is weighty in a different way.
The voicing on the cello makes a big difference. Sometimes it's so welcoming. Sometimes the second beat is consonant but has this incredible energy carrying us forward. So much depends on this relationship between the first and the second beat, on the harmony underneath, on the way the instrument is being used, on where it falls in the phrase, because of course it doesn't happen every bar. If it did, it wouldn't be special. But perhaps most importantly, it's what the performer brings to it. I like to say that it's not bowings that create the music, but the music that creates or at least suggests the bowings. And this couldn't be more true than in a French dance like the Sarabande, where the bowing patterns are such an integral part of the dance's movement, almost like the step patterns themselves. Here we have some common Sarabande rhythms, to which I've added bowing patterns that are known to have been used by the players in Jean-Baptiste Lully's famous court orchestra. And the same types of practices also appear later in French string manuals from the early 18th century. T here stands for tirer, to pull or down bow, and P for pousser, to push or up bow. What immediately catches the eye is the Lullian practice of the down bow always coinciding with the meter, with that strong first beat of the bar. Even, for instance, in example C and the second bar.
Reportedly, this was one of the greatest skills of the Lullius, that even with so many repeated down bows, this isn't what the Italians and Germans were doing. Nothing unpleasant is heard, but rather that the length of the lines is wonderfully bound up with a marvelous liveliness, an astonishing uniformity of beat with the variety of movements, and a sensitive beauty with lively playing.
Notice also that no effort is made to place down bows on the second beats of the bar. You don't see the bow retaken for the second beat, or an up bow on the first beat in order that the second beat would arrive with the down bow. That bowing would go with a different metrical orientation. This isn't to say that the second beat can't be played down bow, for instance, if the first beat were to consist of two separate notes. The rhythmic patterns in examples A and B are perhaps the most common. We have seen them already repeatedly, and also they're very familiar from suites 1 and 6 and 2 with some variation. This rhythm almost seems to be announcing, I am a Sarabande. We see the quarter note motion of example C in suite 3 and especially suite 4. Suite 5 also has this quarter note motion of example C, but perhaps also a little bit of example D with the half note quarter rhythmic pattern. Whether or not Bach or contemporary cellists who would have played his suites had these bowings in mind or used them, we simply can't know. It's very possible that they didn't. We don't want to be rigid about bowings, and certainly a skilled player can make almost anything work. At the same time, these French Sarabande rhythmic patterns are so much a part of Bach's music that it seems like a really good place to start with the bowings that clearly were associated with them. It's one more element to add to our toolbox to help us find this pace and flow of the Sarabande. Its beautifully balanced form, the sense of meter, the special second beat, and all of the expressions that are just waiting to be explored.